Resuming debate, the honourable member for Calgary-Midnapore.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Je vais commencer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'll be starting by saying that I'll be sharing my time with the member for Mégantic-l'Érable. With that,
Mr. Speaker, here we are a year later, and I wish I had a different story to tell. I'm starting to feel very much like a broken record, Mr. Speaker, but the fact is we are having this opposition motion today because, in fact, there are many Canadians who feel left behind. Despite all of the comments and the facts and the quotes given by my colleagues across the aisle in the government, we as the official opposition felt it was absolutely necessary to have this opposition day motion in an effort to recognize the tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of Canadians and workers who have been left behind. And you who are listening to me know who you are. That is why we are having this opposition motion here today. And it is unfortunately, Mr. Speaker, to use the words of one of my favorite pop songs of 2005, the artist JoJo, "Too Little, Too Late." I recall, Mr. Speaker, in December when I was plucked from this House by my whip because it was announced on Reuters that a plan for the airline sector was coming. And I was very excited about this plan, very nervous, but very excited. And I led question period the next day, but the result was, Mr. Speaker, no plan. Most recently, Mr. Speaker, a couple of weeks ago, we saw within the Globe and Mail the very excitement that a plan for the airline sector was on the horizon and imminent. And, you know, this is the word that's been used a lot, Mr. Speaker, imminent. And in fact, Mr. Speaker, I'm on my second transport minister, if I may say so. And still, Mr. Speaker, no plan. And you know, all of this conversation actually began back in November, but still no plan. And I could go on and on about the devastation, Mr. Speaker, and I have before, but we've seen jobs lost, routes lost, market share lost, leakage, and this is a result of the government's inaction. You know, before we had the gross domestic product for the tourism industry of almost 50 to 70% down since 2020. Travel restrictions could also lead to significant losses in other industries, with the overall impact resulting in a 1.2 to 1.7% reduction in GDP. You know, whereas the U.S. government, Mr. Speaker, on the other hand, has provided $7 billion in support already for their industry, and as a result, they will have a significant advantage. In October 2020, Mr. Speaker, the main carriers for the United States, including Delta, United, American Airlines, were operating at approximately 50% of their typical capacity. In comparison, Canadian carriers were operating at 25% of capacity, so no comparison, Mr. Speaker. You know, same with Europe. In October of 2019, Mr. Speaker, Canadian carriers held approximately 64% of capacity transatlantic share, while European carriers held 36% only by Canadians. So, you know, in 2020 of October, each Canadian and European held 50%. So it has changed significantly. In addition, Mr. Speaker, we have seen the loss of regional routes significantly. So in Canada alone, we've seen service loss to Charlottetown, Fredericton, Deer Lake, Mr. Speaker, Sydney, Nova Scotia, St. John's, New Brunswick, Bathurst, New Brunswick, Wabash, Newfoundland, Gaspé, Quebec, Baie-Comeau, Quebec, Montjoly, Quebec, Verdure, Quebec, Kingston, Ontario, and North Bay, Ontario, Mr. Speaker. Air Canada, Mr. Speaker, is currently losing an average of $15 million per day, and they've had to lay off approximately 20,000 employees as a result of COVID-19. And of course, Mr. Speaker, as well, international carriers are able to indirectly access several Canadian markets through nearby U.S. airports, known as leakage. And we see this with the 3 Bs, as I refer to Bellingham, Burlington, and Buffalo. Now, we have asked the government, Mr. Speaker, on several occasions to take action. We've asked for rapid testing, testing on arrival, testing on departure, and industry took the initiative through many pilot projects. In my own hometown of YYC, we saw the Calgary Border Pilot Project, where a test was on arrival, the second test was at day 6 or 7, and if necessary, there was a third test. But what we saw, Mr. Speaker, was the possibility to reduce the quarantine quarantine time up to an entire week, and the government did not act upon this, Mr. Speaker. We also saw the McMaster project, Mr. Speaker, out of the Toronto Pearson Airport, where there was testing upon arrival, again, second test, and then a third test, with 7% detected upon arrival, 0.7, I should say, 0.3% on day 7, and less than 0.1 on day 14, Mr. Speaker. YVR also had its own pilot project, but unfortunately, Mr. Speaker, with the implementation of the 3-day quarantine, we saw hotel quarantine, we saw the dismissal of all of these projects, unfortunately. Mr. Speaker, we look ahead to what the future looks like for the Canadian aviation sector, and it is grim, with no routes, expensive fares, and stopovers. As I mentioned, Mr. Speaker, many regional routes have suspended service to many areas, and it will be several years, Mr. Speaker, before we see these routes reinstated. And airlines are very concerned about the loss of market share if they are unable to connect to smaller regions. As well, Mr. Speaker, I'm very concerned about pilots and the tens of thousands of workers who are leaving Canada to go to work in other jurisdictions. And we need to prevent their jobs from moving to countries with an established aviation sector rather than keeping here in Canada where they should be. As well, Mr. Speaker, I've mentioned it before, the conversation about sun destinations. I was able, Mr. Speaker, just 2 weeks ago to go on the internet to Expedia and book a ticket from Vancouver with a 31-minute stop in Seattle that carries on to Puerto Vallarta, Mr. Speaker. So American carriers are in fact still able to take Canadians to sun destinations where our own airlines have been told that they cannot travel to sun destinations, Mr. Speaker. It's not right and it's not fair. It's failing Canadians and Canadian businesses, Mr. Speaker. So the future looks very grim for aviation, and I worry, Mr. Speaker, about the family in Sherbrooke, Quebec, that wants to take their family to Disney World, and they will not be able to as a result of the cost because of the demand where supply will not be able to meet it, Mr. Speaker. So I am very concerned about that as well. But, Mr. Speaker, in fact, this government has failed at the pandemic from the very beginning. They failed in many regards, including telling Canadians that there was no person-to-person spread of COVID-19, that border control measures and masks don't work. They sent critical supplies of personal protective equipment to China when we in fact had a shortage right here in Canada. They failed to ensure Canadians have access to rapid testing at-home options. They shut down the federal pandemic early warning system just months before COVID-19, Mr. Speaker, all major failures. We've also known since November that Canada is well behind other countries when it comes to vaccine procurement. Justin Trudeau said this was because Canada no longer has any pardon me.
I think the honourable member may have caught that already, but just to refer to other honourable members by their title or their riding name.
I apologize. The Prime Minister said this was because Canada no longer has any domestic production capacity for vaccines. But 7 months prior, in May, the government announced tens of millions of dollars to increase domestic production capacity and said that 2 Canadian production facilities would have the capacity to produce 70,000 to 100,000 doses per month by summer 2020, with an even greater production capacity in the months to follow. And in August, the government said that Canada would be able to make 250,000 vaccine doses by November. Well, we know now, Mr. Speaker, that this didn't happen. The reality now, Mr. Speaker, is that Canada is behind the US, the UK, the European Union, Mexico, Brazil, India, and Indonesia for vaccine procurement. Mr. Speaker, that's over 2.7 billion people, or 1/3 of the population of the planet that is ahead of Canada for a vaccine. Where is the Prime Minister's plan? Mr. Speaker, what we have learned is that the Liberal government is that it is entirely possible to spend billions of dollars and still leave millions of Canadians behind. Canada's unemployment rate is currently at 8.5%, among the highest in the G7, despite spending more than any other country in the OECD. As of January 21st, according to Statistics Canada, Canada now has 858,000 fewer jobs than it did in February of last year before COVID COVID-19 began. Canada has now gone, Mr. Speaker, 460 days without a federal budget, and the Prime Minister has indicated struggling Canadians should not expect one anytime soon. Mr. Speaker, if the government has failed the airline sector, if the government has failed Canadian workers, if the government has failed at the pandemic, how can we possibly count on them to lead us out of this pandemic and save our economy? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions?